When you think of a creature created in a lab, what really springs to mind? Perhaps Frankenstein's monster, or the Fly, or even the Incredible Hulk. Well, a lot of the time in reality, the creatures that scientists are tinkering with are a whole lot less impressive. Some, though, are actually pretty tiny, like insects, or others innocuous, like see-through frogs. But as soon as you begin to look at the idea of creating creatures or poking around in their DNA, that begins to bring up a whole lot of questions. From a glow-in-the-dark pup to the world's most famous sheep, here are 15 terrifying creatures created by science. Number 15. The Vacanti mouse experiment. Here we go, straight in with one of the most famous lab creations, the Vacanti mouse, and that's the mouse with a human ear on its back. You know, that one. Back in the late 1990s, there were a couple of doctors from Harvard, brothers who were named Joseph Charles Vacanti, and an engineer from MIT named Bob Langer. These guys were not out to really create Dr. Terror's House of Horrors. That actually had a much more useful idea in mind. They wanted to develop a way to create human body parts in a lab, which also sounds like a horror movie in and of itself, but hear me out a little bit. They wanted to be able to genetically engineer body parts for people who had lost them, either through accidents or illness. This noble cause would be inspired by the organ shortage of the 1980s, and they had hoped to begin the blueprints for building all kinds of body bits in a lab. Anyway, one of the things that the surgeons found most difficult to reconstruct in patients was their missing ears. They're an awkward and fiddly shape, and that's where they decided to begin. The scientists were trying to build biodegradable scaffoldings that will dissolve in the body and use them to grow body parts. They only managed to reach this stage of the process before the funding dwindled, and they've not been able to bring the extraordinary engineering into the human stage yet. So there aren't any people walking around with Vacanti ears on their chest or their butt. Not yet, anyway. Number 14. Human-pig hybrid created in the lab. Science is always attempting something new and crazy in the hopes of improving human lives, but sometimes those experiments seem like terrifying nightmares, and they certainly give a whole lot of people the heebie-jeebs. So why on earth would you actually want to create a human-pig hybrid in a lab? What could possibly this offer to the improvement of humanity? Well, as it turns out, the idea is not that far removed from the old ear mouse experiment. Scientists are attempting to develop a way to grow human organs inside of animals in order to use them in transplants. It really could be the beginning of a horror story, but it might just be the beginning of an incredible life-saving breakthrough as well. This experiment has naturally caused a whole lot of controversy, as these things probably should. It's definitely the right thing to ask questions. The funding for the project was put on hold while these ethical questions were considered. Just because science can do something doesn't necessarily mean that it should. And this particular experiment raised the specter of different species having humanized brains, along with the idea of them being released by accident into the wild. I mean, if the movies can imagine it, right? Number 13. The two-headed dog. Now, there's this general idea that back in the 20th century, biology was mostly concerned with taking things apart in order to discover how they worked, and now the 21st century is interested in putting them back together with some added extras. Way back in the 1950s, there were a lot of questionable things being done in the name of science. In the Soviet Union, a doctor by the name of Vladimir Dimitrov was definitely up to all sorts of strange experiments in his lab. He was pioneering transplant technology, but the early days of that science looked pretty horrifying, to be honest. So, Dimitrov liked to swap bits of dogs around, transplanting vital organs between them, and figuring out how the things worked. This is a literal horror story. He had gone so far with the innard swapping that he thought the next obvious thing to do was to transplant the head of one dog onto another and create the two-headed dog. He took 23 attempts at this surgery, with apparently varying degrees of success. And I should imagine that success is relative, especially for the poor dogs. But as the old saying goes, try again, and on the 24th attempt, he had the most publicity and filled the papers with images of his mad scientist two-headed dog. And this experiment went down in history. Number 12. Genetically modified salmon. With a little bit of tinkering in a lab, scientists can do some absolutely abnormal things. But how about a fast-growing salmon that's essentially 99.999999986% the same as a regular Atlantic salmon? However, they've sprinkled in a little teeny bit of growth hormone from the Chinook salmon that makes this supercharged fish grow at a faster rate as it feeds all year and reaches maturity a lot faster than the regular Atlantic salmon. And that's wild. Well, actually, no, it's farmed. Overfishing and an insatiable appetite for salmon has had a devastating effect on wild salmon populations over recent decades, so the development of these genetically modified salmon is a way for producers to grow salmon more quickly and therefore more cheaply, which, as we all know, is usually the deciding factor in pretty much everything. Anyway, this sort of genetic engineering does raise some questions about exactly what this might mean for the delicate balance of ecosystems and living organisms in general. A souped-up salmon may not seem to be a particularly menacing idea. I mean, it doesn't have massive teeth or even a homicidal personality, but the trouble is, there may be unknown and unpredictable effects that have yet to be discovered. This is likely less about an immediate risk to human health from eating a genetically modified fish, but rather the long-term effects on the species themselves and their place in the ecosystem. But you know, if science can find ways to feed people and prevent hunger in the long term, then perhaps these experiments are leading towards a better world. I don't know though. This one seems the tiniest bit profit-driven to me. Number 11. Fluorescent puppy is the world's first transgenic dog. Do you keep losing your dog at night? Do you need a way to spot them in the dark? Well, this could be the ideal solution for all you dog owners out there suffering from night dog blindness. But wait, there's more. These cute puppies were cloned in a South Korean lab in order to test whether genetic material from another species could be successfully placed into the dogs. Weird. They all produce a fluorescent protein that glows under an ultraviolet light. Scientists would use genetic material from sea anemones that give off a red fluorescent glow and introduced it into the dog's cells during cloning. I mean, this all kind of sounds like a sci-fi movie plot to me that you would see on like Mystery Science Theater 3000. Anyway, the general idea is that this kind of testing opens up whole other areas in medical research, which apparently scientists can use to study human diseases and ways to cure them by using similar sorts of techniques. It all seems as though this might all suck for the dogs though, because they're still living and breathing beings even if they are clones. The ethical questions that surround cloning and animal testing don't go away just because something is deemed a success, and this one is a difficult one to figure out. Number 10. Belgian Blue. Now basically all types of fancy cows and horses are genetically engineered in one way or another. Selective breeding? Well, that's just the old-time sort of science for growing breeds that were more hardy or fast and made better meat. But nowadays, what we do with that sort of thing enables white coats and petri dishes instead of a farmer in a field with a couple of cows. And I'm sorry to disappoint you, but the Belgian Blue isn't exactly what I would call blue. Not in the blue is the sky or like a sapphire sense. Although it might be sad, I guess, which is a pity, because it just looks like a regular old cow to me. What makes these cows one of the lab-created creatures is that the modern breed would be developed in the 1950s by a scientist that went by the name of Professor Hanset, who bred them to be made into a particularly tasty beef by using artificial insemination. Ew. These animals were bred from stock that had a specific genetic mutation that apparently makes very lean meat. And when you begin poking around in all the stuff, this is actually more like a horror story in the end. Number 9. See-through frogs. And here we are, some see-through frogs. Less glass-like and more murky, but for why? Why do these science people want to make a boring old pale frog when we have a veritable rainbow of these animals? The idea behind the transparent frog is actually to study the internal organs and its blood vessels throughout its entire life, without having to kill and dissect the thing. So I suppose that's an improvement. Although the frogs in question are still going to be tested on, injected with various chemicals and compounds, and they just get to hang around and see the results instead of being bumped off to explore the outcome. It does suck to be a science frog, any way that you look at it. The science boffins at the Institute for Amphibian Biology at Hiroshima University have developed the transparent frog so that they can study the effects of drugs and genetic behavior in them, apparently making great leaps forward in medicine, helping to make it easier to study and treat diseases, and benefiting development in cancer research. It's still animal testing though. It could transform lives of cancer patients in the future, sure, and it's incredible to see inside the frogs because you can literally see their heart beating. Number 8. Transgenic cotton and sterile insect. Crop pests can devastate harvests and be a cruel result after long months of labor for a farmer because they lose a majority of their efforts to an invasion of a greedy pest. So there are some white-coated science people trying out new and sometimes controversial methods to control the pest population. In Arizona, the cotton fields have been menaced by a ravenous beast for almost a century, the pink bollworm. While these creatures may be tiny, they can certainly cause massive destruction, munching through field after field of cotton. So the plan is to genetically engineer the pesky pink bollworm to become sterile and at the same time modify the cotton plants that have a deadly insect-killing protein inside of them. Then the next stage would be to drop a whole load of the critters on the modified cotton fields and then cross their fingers that this would eradicate the blighters once and for all. It's all complicated and involves a certain amount of good faith from the farmers who have to resist using any of their usual methods to do pest control, but in the end, the program has seemed to work because the pink bollworms were finally dispatched with, and the need to use all those gross insecticides was also eradicated. Number 7. Genetically modified cyborg dragonfly. These creepy robot insects are leading the way in the field of potential cyborg spy bugs. This might sound like a totally bananas plot in a sci-fi movie, but these cyborg dragonflies are actually the real deal. Drones are a technology that's come a long way in a short amount of time, but those machines are still too big and obvious for some things that people want them to do. But just imagine if you could fly something as small and agile as an insect into anywhere you wanted to. It would make the idea of being a fly on the wall a reality, and that's absolutely terrifying for my paranoia complex. Scientists have created a genetically modified dragonfly by genetically engineering dragonflies with what they're calling steering neurons, light-sensitive cells which are placed into the insect's spinal cord. The minuscule structures in the insect's eyes send light pulses back to their brains, and this controls the direction of the dragonfly by remote control. They've also been equipped with a tiny backpack which has sensors on it in order to collect data. The theory is that the researchers can effectively steer the dragonfly where they like in order to collect information from places that humans can't reach. And if you ask me, it's just super creepy. Number 6. Ghost hearts. Doris Taylor, well, she's a woman with a dream. She dreams of building tailor-made human organs for heart transplants in her laboratory. And work at the Texas Heart Institute? Well, it's underway to make that dream into a reality. The team of scientists tasked with this regenerative medicine research at the THI have created incredible human heart scaffolds. These hearts are suspended in bioreactors, drained of blood and then pumped full of stem cells, and hooked up to artificial lungs and a blood pump, and then they grow. Of course, you all understood that, right? This incredible bioengineering is working towards a future where heart transplant patients will be able to have the hearts built for them to their own genetic material, which removes the need for donors and anti-rejection drugs. It's an amazing and life-saving concept. So far, they've created over 100 of these extraordinary ghost hearts, and with every heart, they learn and develop more. One day, this is going to become a possibility. Just imagine the lives that this could save. Number 5. First monkey genetically engineered to have Parkinson's is created. In controversial experiments on monkeys, scientists have made all kinds of discoveries that have pushed medicine forwards. But the field of animal research is full of ethical problems and experiments on primates whose brains are similar to ours, and it brings up as many questions as it answers. While it is true that these experiments give scientists the opportunity to make important discoveries in the field of human health, deliberately engineering a monkey's brain to suffer from a debilitating disease like Parkinson's is a difficult idea to square up in your mind. But scientists in Japan have done it, and this research may change the future of tens of thousands of people one day. The research team were planning to study the neural damage that was done by the disease as it progresses, and to develop drugs that will effectively slow down the devastating progression of the illness. There are some pretty strong arguments against the use of monkeys in these experiments, though. In fact, animal testing is much less common in the UK and some other countries as a result of regulation and the use of other technology instead of living creatures. Even those who advocate for using monkeys for the Parkinson's research acknowledge that there are many limitations and that there will still be many things that the modified monkeys just won't be able to answer. Number 4. Genetically modified dogs. Now, like we've seen already, animals have been modified by humans for centuries. By employing selective breeding, people have been able to, in effect, alter and limit the genetic traits of innumerable species in the quest for domesticated farm animals, or even stronger horses to pull equipment, or a greater milk yield. This is how farming works these days. But creating better pets or working dogs in a lab is still kind of new ground, even though the result is essentially the same in the end. A group of scientists in China have been tweaking the DNA of dogs in an effort to create a more muscular breed. This is the first requirement that researchers have been working on. The plan is to be able to edit the dog's DNA to make other alterations to its physical traits or even its temperament. This stuff is getting into the realms of those sci-fi movie monsters, that's for sure. The general idea is that the dogs will have stronger running ability and will make good hunting or even working police animals. But there are plenty of breeds that already serve the purpose very effectively, so you do have to wonder exactly what the point of all of it is. Maybe there is actually more to it than what's being revealed. It could be a breed of robo-dogs which can be controlled remotely. What do you think about it? Let me know in the comments below. Number 3. The spider goat. A little goat named Freckles may appear to be exactly like all the other goats, except that she's not, and is in fact only one of her kind on the planet. At the moment, that is. Freckles, well, she's not only a goat, but she's also part spider. Why? Just why? Well, researchers at Utah State University are developing a whole new field of study using genetic engineering to build animals that make things that humans want. It's weird and it's creepy. Freckles has been crossed with spider DNA in order to understand the dragline silk that spiders use to catch themselves when they fall. And apparently this spider-spun silk is incredibly strong, even stronger than Kevlar. And I guess that's why there are certain people who hope to harness the technology. I mean, who might want something like that? But why put it in a goat? Well, for starters, you can't farm spiders. They're apt to eat one another. So that makes working with them just a little bit tricky. The idea behind the goat-spider combo is that the spider silk gene was placed into the DNA that stimulates milk production in the goat. The goat will then make milk that contains spider silk proteins. The milk can be processed in the lab, and it leaves behind just the silk protein. Now, they're in the testing stages of using these super strong threads in the human body to repair ligaments, so soon people could actually be walking around with bits of spider goat holding them together. It sure is a weird world out there. Number 2. The sudden death mosquito. Aside from sounding like a death metal band name, the tiny mosquito is the world's deadliest killer. These insects kill one person every 12 seconds. The blood-sucking creatures spread malaria, dengue fever, and the Zika virus, along with many more. Scientists have been in years-long quests trying to find ways of eradicating the mosquito's disease-spreading ability. By modifying the mosquitoes in a lab, scientists have actually found a way to limit its ability to reproduce. Scientists inject a gene into the mosquito egg that they've called the self-limiting gene, and that will intervene and prevent certain genes in the mosquito's development from being properly expressed. In practice, this means that when mosquito offspring begin to develop, the gene will then kick in and cause them to die off before they reach maturity, so they won't be able to reproduce or spread disease. When these modified mosquitoes have been released in tests around the world, the scientists have not seen any adverse effects so far. But the idea of genetic modification in general has a whole bunch of people expressing their concerns. Although when it comes to these potentially life-saving mosquitoes, the loudest voices speaking out against it do tend to come from places where people aren't even dying of mosquito-borne diseases every 12 seconds. I wonder how they'd feel differently if the shadow of deadly malaria was stalking their children every night. Number 1. Dolly the sheep. Now, perhaps the most famous sheep that's ever been, Dolly made her way into the history books when back in 1997, her birth would be announced and she was officially the world's first cloned sheep. What made Dolly so special was that she was cloned from a single individual rather than the other kind of cloning that had previously been successful, which involves clones being created from a single fertilized egg, making them all clones of each other. It had taken decades of failures for scientists to clone any species from existing adults, but that's exactly what they finally were able to achieve with Dolly. Dolly would be cloned from a mammary gland from an adult ewe when the researchers used electrical pulses to fuse the cell with an unfertilized egg cell from which they had removed the nucleus. This was to trick the egg into receiving the mammary cell and then abandon its normal growth cycle. It took a whole lot of experimentation to figure out the extremely delicate balance of the procedure, but eventually they created an embryo which was then transferred to a surrogate mother who, after a normal gestation, would give birth to Dolly. Dolly ended up living for 6 years with a normal functioning heart, brain, liver, and other organs, which were all a genetic match for the original DNA of the mammary gland cell that she was cloned from. Her body is now preserved and on display at the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh.